Welcome to #Wednesdays Weekly, a weekly seminar/information session in collaboration with the voluntary sector and public sector partners, brought to you by Action Together. This week, the host is Wendy Stringer, the Domestic Abuse Coordinator for Rochdale, who will be delivering a session about domestic abuse awareness in Rochdale Borough. Over to Wendy.
Morning everybody. Thanks for having me this morning. Just so you know, I can't see you, so if you're smiling or waving at me or anything, I can't see you, so I can only see my screen. So good morning. And my name is Wendy Stringer, and as she said, I'm the Domestic Abuse Coordinator for Rochdale. And what that post basically is I work for the local authority based in community safety, and my post is there to ensure that we have a more coordinated approach to domestic abuse in the borough. So I work across the partnership with our statutory partners such as children's social care, the police, health, etc., and also with our voluntary sector and our specialist domestic abuse providers. So this morning, this training is information and support for professionals and those are working or volunteering with families that are working with families during the coronavirus. So I'm just going to give you some information about what domestic abuse is, the possible impacts that the coronavirus may be having on domestic abuse, and also some information about local services and what we're doing as a local authority to address domestic abuse. So Rochdale Council, we're working together with other public sector organisations, including the NHS and Link for Life, RBH, etc., to ensure that all possible actions are being taken to safeguard people during coronavirus. If you can see there's a web link, and that's got a wealth of information specifically about coronavirus and what the local authority is doing about it. As you may know as well, we also have had helplines set up that Action Together have been helping to support with volunteers, etc., and those helplines and community hubs have been for anybody to ring in with any coronavirus related issue at all during this period of the pandemic. So if you do need any further information specifically on that, that's the web pages that you need to go to there, and I can send these slides out after. So just to give you an idea of the government's guidance and campaign about domestic abuse during COVID-19, the government early on during lockdown released a publication campaign, a comms campaign, and they issued guidance for people affected by domestic abuse during COVID-19. Part of this was them clarifying the rules of isolation and clarifying that people can breach the rules of isolation if they are escaping domestic abuse. So as you know, we're in lockdown as a country at the moment. This is being lifted slightly, but the government have been clear throughout that anybody can breach those lockdown rules if they need to flee to get help for domestic abuse. They also issued information and support about where you can get help over child contact or welfare benefits, because as you can imagine, these have been issues affecting people. And they raised a public awareness campaign called #YouAreNotAlone. And if you can see on that slide there, the little purple icon, that is some of the comms media pictures that they've been using for their campaign. Just so you know, locally in Rochdale, we've had our own domestic abuse campaign in terms of communications. We've had posters and leaflets in supermarkets and pharmacies, and we've also had a presence on our social media. And the purpose of that, obviously, was to highlight to people that services are still running during the COVID-19 and people can still get support for domestic abuse. So just before we go on to domestic abuse generally, I just want to highlight safeguarding. I'm sure you're all aware in your professional roles, but we'll just recap. Safeguarding means protecting the most vulnerable people and adults from abuse and neglect. So during COVID pandemic, professionals and volunteers may be coming into contact with individuals and families that they don't usually work with, or they might not have even met before. So as professionals and practitioners, if you see something or you're told something or something just doesn't feel right to you and you're concerned about somebody's safety, then you need to report it. Don't ignore it. It's vital that we let our families know that we have Rochdale support services are available at this time. And I think we're in unprecedented times that we've never been in before. Everything feels a bit surreal, a bit unusual, and we do feel as professionals that we're concerned about asking those questions or flagging up issues that we think might be there. But it's more important than ever during COVID-19 that we act on any disclosures or concerns that we do have. And the contacts that you would contact if you're concerned about a child or a family member that may be experiencing domestic abuse. The number and email on the screen there is for our local EHASH, that's our Complex Early Help and Safeguarding Hub. And you will probably know that that is where any phone calls that you need to ring through there about concerns about children that are impacted by domestic abuse or any other type of vulnerability. Also, obviously, we've got the police number there, which is 999 if it's an emergency, or 101 if it's a non-emergency. The police actually also have what they call a domestic abuse car. So if somebody rings in with a non-emergency domestic abuse case, they can make an appointment with the domestic abuse car, which is police officers obviously, to come round to see them at a time that's convenient, and then they can report their concerns about domestic abuse. Also, there's something called silent solution. So if somebody does ring 999 in an immediate danger situation, but for some reason they're unable to speak, it may be that the perpetrator is there, or they can't speak for whatever reason. If they're ringing from a mobile handset and they press 55, this will indicate to the operator that they need the police. Other useful contacts, I've put my own email on there. You can contact me at any time if you need any kind of support or guidance about what services are available locally. And also we've got our Rochdale domestic abuse web pages on there. Those web pages are updated on a regular basis, and we oversee those as a local authority, and they will give you up-to-date information on the services locally that can support people for domestic abuse. They also have details on about national numbers, online support, etc. So if you need an up-to-date look at what the services are that are available in Rochdale, those pages will be able to help you. So initially, I've just put the definition of what is domestic abuse, and this is the government definition. It's not currently a statutory definition, and that is something that's going through on the domestic abuse bill through the House of Commons at the moment. But this is what we have as our definition from the government for domestic abuse. It's any incident or patterns of incidents of controlling, coercive, threatening behaviour, violence or abuse between those aged 16 or over who are or who have been intimate partners or family members, regardless of gender or sexual orientation. The abuse can encompass, but is not limited to, psychological, physical, sexual, economic, and emotional forms of abuse. So that's our government definition, and that's what we are using until it gets changed with the domestic abuse bill. And it will only be changed slightly in the fact that it will be made a statutory definition, and it will also include economic abuse on a statutory basis as well. So what is coercive? Hello, sorry.
So sorry to interrupt. Would you mind just speaking up very slightly? Just had a comment on the chat about that they couldn't quite hear you.
All right.
Moving the microphone a bit closer on your headset.
Is that better?
Is
that better?
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Sorry about that, guys. Is that okay? Right. Thank you. So what is coercive control? So coercive control was made an offence in 2015, and that was because the government recognised that domestic abuse wasn't just about physical abuse. So often when you see poster campaigns and adverts that are talking about domestic abuse, you will see somebody with a black eye or some kind of injury. And that's often what people think about when they think about domestic abuse. They think about the physical aspects of it and the assault side of it. But the government recognised that it's far more than that. And that's why they introduced the offence of coercive control in 2015. And that offence carries up to a maximum of 5 years custodial sentence with it. So their definition of coercive control is as follows. Coercive behaviour is an act or a pattern of acts of assaults, threats, humiliation and intimidation or other abuse that is used to harm, punish or frighten a victim. Controlling behaviour is a range of acts designed to make a person subordinate and or dependent by isolating them from sources of support, exploiting their resources and capacities for personal gain, and depriving them of the means for independence, resistance and escape, and regulating their everyday behaviour. So examples of things like this may be stopping somebody seeing their friends and family, monitoring their every movement, telling them what they can wear, what they can eat, tracking them on social media. That might be putting spyware on their devices or hacking into their accounts to monitor who they're speaking to and what they're doing. Those are examples of coercive and controlling behaviour, or making threats to them, threats to harm their children, extended family members, and using tools to degrade and humiliate that person. All these things can be done without actually having to physically assault somebody. And that is one of the things we need to really consider when we're working with our families, is that a person may be experiencing domestic abuse under coercive control. And you do hear some people say sometimes, well, they've never hit me, so I didn't think it was abuse, or he doesn't do this, he doesn't do that, he's just a bit controlling, or he's just protective over me. And as professionals, it's for us to try and help those people unpick what's happening for them and recognise that this is domestic abuse they're experiencing. So as you can see on the screen, domestic abuse can include all of the things that are on this screen. Physical abuse is the first point on it. As we know, physical abuse is the hitting, the punching, the slapping, etc. Sexual abuse, and this can include rape or making somebody engage in sexual activity against their will, such as making them watch pornographic films or engage with other people that they don't want to sexually. Emotional abuse and psychological abuse, this can be putting somebody down, calling them names, affecting their mental health, degrading them, humiliating them. Coercive control, we've just talked about, using those methods to make somebody do what they want and isolating them from further support from external sources such as family or agencies. Harassment and stalking. It's worth mentioning here that in January of this year, they introduced something called stalking protection orders. These are new protection orders specifically for the act of stalking. So harassment is unwanted behaviour from somebody, where somebody might be getting texts or negative behaviour from somebody that they don't want. Stalking carries a much heavier offence. It carries a 5-year custodial offence, and stalking is repetitive, obsessive behaviour. We've actually got some training on stalking and harassment being delivered tomorrow. If you can't get on that, or you're not already on that, if you go on the web pages that I mentioned earlier, there will be details of how to get on the next session for that. So that is one of the things that they have also recognised nationally, that there's a difference between harassment and stalking, and something like 70% of domestic homicides have been stalked. Also, in stalking cases, 50% of stalking cases nationally are from unknown people, so people that are not in a relationship or have been in a relationship, and approximately 50% are from people that have been in relationships, so ex-partners or current partners. So if somebody discloses to you that somebody is following them or outside their property or sending them relentless text messages or presents, etc., it's really worth thinking about stalking and checking out whether that is something that's occurring for them, because it's a serious offence. Financial and economic abuse. This can be from somebody getting a loan in somebody else's name without their knowledge, or making them get a loan or mortgage, etc., when they don't want to, or it can be from controlling the finances within the house, withdrawing access to money, etc. Digital and online abuse. This can be, as I said before, monitoring somebody's online activity by putting spyware on their devices, etc., or it can be making threats to put intimate information about that person online. These are also offences. Honour-based abuse. That can be when abuse takes place in the name of honour for a family, stating that that it is being done to protect the family honour. It can often include extended family members such as uncles, aunties, mothers, fathers, sisters, etc. So in honour-based abuse, there can often be more than one perpetrator. Forced marriage is forced marriage. It's making somebody, one or two people, enter into a marriage against their will, and you can get forced marriage orders to prevent this. It's not the same as arranged marriage, which is when two people are willing to go into a relationship and a marriage willfully. Female genital mutilation is the cutting of female genitals. It's illegal in this country. It's illegal to take a girl or young woman out of the country to have it done in a different country. Adolescents to parent violence and abuse. Under the actual definition, the government definition of domestic abuse as it stands, Some child-to-parent violence wouldn't fall under it because they would be under the age of 16. But what adolescence and child-to-parent violence is basically is when you've got a child or adolescent that is being abusive to their parent or caregiver in the home. And we do have an intervention for that in Rochdale. We have a programme called Break for Change, which I'll talk to you about later. So, signs of domestic abuse. So, just to be aware that anybody can be at risk of domestic abuse. So, that's something that we really need to consider. It doesn't matter what somebody's gender is, their age, their nationality, or their religion. Anyone can be at risk of domestic abuse. It's not something that only affects women, although women, statistically, females are more likely to be a victim. But we do have male victims of domestic abuse, and we need to be conscious and aware of that when we're working with our families. We do have services that will support males as well locally. So signs of domestic abuse, as we were talking about before, the physical signs. So you may notice with somebody that they have physical signs of domestic abuse, such as a black eye or pulled out hair or a broken leg or etc. And then the more obvious signs of domestic abuse. The emotional signs of domestic abuse may be that you notice a change in somebody's behaviour. So they may become more withdrawn or depressed or feel a bit jumpy. Also, their behaviour in general may change. So you could notice an increase in drugs or alcohol use. You could notice that if they come to appointments, they always have their partner with them and they're uneasy in front of their partner, or it looks like they're unhappy to speak, or they feel jumpy, etc. So just noticing their behaviour and noticing any change in their behaviour if you already know that client or family. Antisocial behaviour. Often when we're working in neighbourhoods, we have reports of antisocial behaviour, which may be parties or loud noises or a lot of arguing, etc. And sometimes this is antisocial behaviour and it is what it looks like. But sometimes when we start unpicking the details of those cases, loud arguments and rows and stuff may be due to domestic abuse. And it's about us really just thinking outside the box and considering what's really going on in this family home. Why are the police being called all the time? Why are the neighbours complaining? Is there any way that we can speak to these tenants on their own? And also, I know we're not doing home visits at the moment due to COVID-19, but when we are in people's homes, it's about looking around that home and really recognising if there's broken stuff there or damage to the home, or it seems like there's a lack of money and you know that that person does have an income of some sort. It's about us asking those questions about what's going on here. In contrast, the home might be immaculate because that might be part of the domestic abuse, that they are being controlled and that they have to have their home in a certain way. Obviously, all these things have a caveat that they're not all, that it doesn't mean that if somebody's home is untidy or has been trashed that they're experiencing domestic abuse. It's just about us constantly having that idea of domestic abuse in our minds and thinking, could this be something to do with domestic abuse? Could there be a deeper issue here? And then it's about us sharing that information and sharing what we know. So if we know that there's other agencies involved with this family, it's about us speaking to those other agencies and putting together the pieces of the jigsaw. Certainly, as I said earlier, if we have concerns about a vulnerable adult or children living in a home, we need to report that to the EHASH because it's everybody's duty. Even if you feel like you don't have that much information, but you have got a hunch, or there's something that is telling you that it's wrong. If you ring these calls and cases into our EHASH, they will have their database of children's social care information and they can check whether the family has been supported before. They have access to health systems and to police systems. So you might just bring a nugget of information, but when they look at the backstory to that family, it tells them that there's ongoing abuse and then they can take the appropriate action. They will never be concerned that you've rang up with something that's not important. They would prefer that you rang in and kind of ran that past them. Also, people can ring up anonymously and people can email in anonymously, which we have seen an increase in during COVID. And we have been encouraging that via our social media and our comms. We are asking people, if you're concerned about your neighbours and you think something's not going on, ring it into the EHASH because at this time, most children are not in school, so we haven't got those extra eyes and ears that we have normally. So, impact of domestic abuse on a child. So, the impact of domestic abuse on children is devastating and can be long lasting. Obviously, there can be the increased risk of physical and emotional abuse. So, sometimes children can get caught in the crossfire of the actual domestic abuse and be physically hurt doing that within that. There's risks to an unborn child, so if anybody is pregnant and you have concerns about them being in an abusive relationship, again, we have a duty to report that as a safeguarding issue. Just because somebody's pregnant doesn't mean that that child is not at risk. There's research that tells us that it impacts on the development of fetuses when somebody is living with conflict or domestic abuse. Other impacts for children are fear and worry and anxiety. So children can carry this round, they may have a lot on their mind. They may display this at school or in nursery, etc., as anger and aggression. So we see it time and time again where children are labelled with labels such as ADHD, or that they've got a problem, and we're getting children's psychiatrists out, etc. And yes, it's important that we do that and look at what the support needs are for that children. But also, when we're considering any child, we need to start looking at their home life and unpicking what that child is living with and how that might be impacting on their behaviour. Also, children may become a carer for the parent or the younger siblings. It may, if they're living with domestic abuse, that may place a huge responsibility on them, that they feel that they have to step in and take care of that parent that's being abused, or take care of the younger siblings. There's long-term psychological harm. As we know, we talk about ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences, and domestic abuse is one of those experiences. Long-term psychological harm in terms of how they develop their own relationships growing up, what their attachment is to the adults in their life, because children may be being made to attach to unsafe adults if they're in chaotic and unsafe households. And then there's delayed development, and that can be in their school development or just their development in their early years in terms of their speech, potty training, etc. And sometimes when a child is going through a particular bad period of domestic abuse, we might see their development go back. So they might start not forgetting how to use the potty, or forgetting their numbers and their colours, etc., which is stuff that they already knew. So again, it's just about us being aware when we're supporting children and working with children, and having that holistic view of the family, about what's going on with that family and what's going on for that child or young person that is affecting them and maybe affecting their behaviour. So some of the barriers for seeking support for people that are experiencing domestic abuse. Fear. And I think I've put fear in red because I think we really need to remember how frightening it can be for somebody that is living in a domestic abuse situation. And we hear time and time again, don't we, people saying, well, why don't they just leave? I won't put up with that. Why don't she just leave? Well, she can go somewhere. It's just simply not that easy for somebody to leave a relationship. As we know, some perpetrators will threaten to kill their victim, to kill their children, or to kill their extended family. And we see it on the press all the time that some perpetrators carry out this threat as well. So for a victim that is living with that threat constantly, it's not easy for them just to get up and leave and go and find support somewhere. So I think we need to remind ourselves of the fear, the coercion control that somebody may be living in. They may even be fearful of speaking to somebody about the domestic abuse, whether that be a professional or a friend or family. And the same with children as well. Children may have been brought up in a home where they're told, you don't tell anybody what happens here, you don't speak to school, you don't speak to anybody. So they again are living in this sense of fear that they can't disclose to somebody. And if they do disclose, what happens then? Are they at more risk? Are they going to get killed then? So we really need to understand the fear that is attached as a barrier for victims seeking support. Also, it may be cultural beliefs. Often perpetrators may use cultural beliefs or religion to tell their victims and survivors that actually I'm entitled to do this because our religion says that we can, or our cultural beliefs say that we can. And that may be backed up by wider community members as well, that actually this is just how things are. The domestic abuse is your fault and you just have to put up with it. Language may be a barrier as well. If somebody doesn't have English as their first language, they may not be aware of what support there is there for them, or what the rights are there for them in this country legally. So, and perpetrators may really keep them away from that. I recall when I was managing the refuge in Rochdale a few years ago, we had a case that came in of a woman that had lived in the UK for 30 years. She didn't speak a word of English, and she'd basically been kept as a slave and had been beaten and abused, and didn't really have any knowledge or understanding of the outside world, of how the UK worked, or what her rights were to access benefits, etc. in the UK. And some people are generally living under those circumstances. Financial as well. Again, people might not know that they are able to claim benefits. People might not know what their financial entitlement may be to a house or a home that they have contributed to, etc. And also, it's about if people are thinking about leaving their home, it's about leaving that lifestyle. People get used to a different way of life. We mustn't think that domestic abuse only affects people of a certain economic status, because you see domestic abuse in very wealthy families as well, and sometimes that will be a barrier to them leaving because they're used to that wealthy lifestyle and they don't want to stop that. They don't want their children to stop going to private school, etc. And then shame or embarrassment. This is something that can stop people seeking support. They feel that they might not be believed. They'll be shamed by the community, particularly for male victims. There's a shame about being a man and letting domestic abuse happen to you. Or if somebody's LGBT community, if they're gay or bisexual, they don't want to be outed to the community. That might be something that's private to them. So people feel embarrassed to talk about it. They don't want to tell people what's going on in their home, particularly if that relationship is often broken up and resumed, broken up and resumed. Sometimes friends and family and even professionals can come across that they're exasperated with that, and a victim or survivor may feel embarrassed that they keep getting back together. But that is part of the cycle, and obviously it's part of the fear and the barriers that are stopping them from leaving. So risk. We talk about risk when we're dealing with domestic abuse all the time. Some of you may have heard of a tool called the Dash Risk Assessment. If you haven't heard of that tool, we are doing Zoom sessions on that on a weekly basis. Our domestic abuse specialists are delivering training on that, on how to complete that tool. Anyone can use it. And what that tool is, it's a risk assessment it's a list of questions basically that you fill in with the victim, asking them about the domestic abuse, and it gives you a score. And that score will determine whether that victim is high risk, medium risk, or standard risk. If they are high risk, we would then refer them into our MARAC, which is a meeting of local professionals, statutory partners, where they share information on that case and put in place an action plan to safeguard those children and that victim. So the Dash Risk Assessment is a useful tool to do this. And as I said, any professional can do it. And if you want additional training on that, go onto our web pages and you'll be able to find out where to get that from. So when you're working with any family, any client that is experiencing domestic abuse or you're concerned they are, you need to be conscious of that risk at any time. The risk to the victim, and that you don't want to be increasing that risk to the victim, and the risk to yourself as a worker working with that family, risk to any children that are living in that home. And again, as I said, it's our duty to refer them into EHASH, and also the increased risk at separation. So in Rochdale, with our domestic homicides in Rochdale, when a person is murdered, we have what is called a domestic homicide review, which looks into what happened in that case and brings out the learning for us so that we can try and ensure it doesn't happen again. Some of the learning that have come out of our homicide cases in Rochdale is that as professionals and communities, we don't have an understanding of how the risk increases when somebody separates from their partner. So sometimes people may think, right, well, she's left now, so now she's safe, when in fact it's the opposite. The risk increases the risk of homicide or serious injury increases when somebody separates. So obviously, if people do want to leave, that's fine. And what we need to do is ensure that they're doing it in a safe way and that we've got measures in place for them when they've left that relationship. So the impact of coronavirus on domestic abuse. So if you've been watching the news, obviously coronavirus is never off the news, and you maybe have been following what's been going on in other countries. Other countries that have been further on during the COVID process have reported huge increases in domestic abuse during the coronavirus, particularly when lockdown started to be lifted because people then were able to get out and access help. China and Italy both reported massive increases in their domestic abuse figures during that time. So the impact of coronavirus is, one of them is there's additional pressures at the moment, people working from home, financial pressures, there's children at home, we're all in smaller spaces with people spending a lot more time together. So there is more time being spent with the abuser. So that's one of the additional pressures. There's a loss of the usual safe spaces. So usually people might have safe spaces they can go to, such as going to work, dropping the children at school, they might visit their mums, their friends, their sisters, whatever. During lockdown, those places, they've gone. People are not allowed to do that. I know they are slightly now, it's changing slightly with bubbles, etc. But throughout, mostly, people have not been able to go and visit those places where they might have been found as safe places. There's less support being available. So the agencies that might have usually been involved with that family, even if it's just normal agencies like school or the GP, etc., or employers, they've not been available. People are working from home, so you're not going to work now and being able to have those private chats with your boss. School have not got those eyes on your children and being able to have a chat with you at pickup to see if everything's all right. So there's less support available, and the support that is available is having to be done via social distancing measures and over the phone, etc. So that obviously causes issues, and there's a problem that the perpetrator may be there and may be listening. So there's an element of risk with that as well. Less access to the phone or internet. So for some people, they will have had their access to phone or internet absolutely cut off during COVID-19. They might not be able to ring anybody, they might not be able to watch TV, they might not be able to go online. So they are really unable to contact anybody or speak to anybody, to tell them about the abuse, or even just to get some support, even just to break that and to have some respite for a period. Economic abuse. For some victims and survivors, they may be being stopped from working at home by their partner, or there may be increased control over the finances because the finances are now under pressure because somebody may have lost their job, etc., or they're on furlough, which is 80% of the income. And then arrangements that are already in place may be breached. So we have seen many cases where separated parents who already had arrangements in place for child contact, these are being breached, and perpetrators are using COVID as an extra excuse to increase the power and control and to breach those child contact arrangements. There's guidance for that online that you can be directed to if you go onto our web pages. Very concerning. Some parents might be taking the child to areas where they know that they're at risk of infection, and the parent obviously even isn't happy about that, etc. So, for the impact of coronavirus on domestic abuse is massive. It's absolutely huge. It has put victims and survivors in a situation where they're being more monitored, more isolated, and more at risk of the abuse escalating. From the calls that we've had into the helplines on a GM level, and certainly the cases that we've had come into our EHASH, we have seen the domestic abuse escalating. So the level of violence and the severity of the abuse has increased during the lockdown period. At the beginning of the lockdown period, we saw a significant drop off in our referrals to our EHASH and a significant drop in our police referrals. And this was concerning to us because we knew it wasn't because domestic abuse had gone away, it was because people had less opportunity to report domestic abuse, less opportunity for professionals to get involved and to flag up concerns. Those stats now have been climbing up gradually over the lockdown period, and they are now soaring again as lockdown is being lifted slightly, and we are seeing huge increases in our domestic abuse cases coming through our safeguarding EHASH and police. So I'm just conscious of time. So when you're having contact with families, some of the advice that we would give is to make sure that you have knowledge of the family that you're speaking to, if possible. Try to have as much information about the family that you can if you're speaking to them, if they're a new family that you don't usually work with. Try and find out if there is a history of domestic abuse, and is the perpetrator likely to be there when you call. So being mindful of risk again. So being mindful that people might be self-isolating with perpetrators that could be listening in on your conversation, reading any text messages or emails that you send. And again, pointing to the point I made before, that the risk of harm and homicide increases at the point of separation. So if somebody is saying to you that they want to leave, that's fine, obviously, but we want to make sure that they do that with support so they can do it safely. Reminding our families that lockdown rules can be breached and that they can access support for domestic abuse during lockdown, and also that our services are still available. Our refuge is still open and taking referrals, so are our victim support services, and so are the police. They will get help during COVID for domestic abuse. So telephone tips might be things like if you're trying to have an open conversation and you're trying to check out whether the perpetrator's there, you can just try and have a generic conversation about socially isolating and saying that they're checking in on everybody to make sure they're safe and they've got everything that they need, and just asking them how they're doing at the moment. Just open questions. Asking them who they're self-isolating with, who's living in that home, is anyone with them now, is the children in the house, and you're just trying to float the idea that you're doing generic check-in calls with people, but obviously what you're really trying to do is to trying to find out who they're living with, can they speak, is it safe to speak, are there children in the home? And then you can do safety planning with them. If there is an opportunity for you to do some safety planning, so the perpetrator's not in, or they're not there, or you're perhaps making contact safely over email or text, you can do safety planning with them. We'll come on to that in a moment. Just so you know, we also have weekly Zoom sessions being delivered on training on safety planning. They're only about 30-40 minutes. You can, for details, go on our web pages again, and they will just give you tips and advice as a professional about how to do safety planning with your clients. So safety planning is exactly what it says it is. It's about having a plan in place, and this can be having a plan in place for someone who's staying in the relationship, or a plan in place for somebody that is leaving the relationship. So for some of our families, they may not be ready to leave that relationship at the moment. So what we want to do with the safety planning is give them tips and advice so that they can stay in it as safely as possible. Again, if they are planning to leave, it's to give them tips and advice so they can leave that relationship as safely as possible, and to highlight to them without scaring them that actually the risk increases at separation, and that's something that they need to be conscious of. So safety planning may involve stuff like safety at home. So if they're planning on staying, it may be giving them ideas and tips about if the abuse is escalating, for them to try to get in a room in the house which could cause them less harm. So avoiding rooms such as the kitchen or the garage where there's objects that might be used to hurt them. It's talking to them about the silent solutions that I mentioned before with the police. If they ring 999 and can't speak and they press 55 from a mobile handset, that will indicate that they need police assistance. It's about them possibly having a safe word or an emoji in place, and that could be with you as a professional, or they could agree that with a family member or friend. And that safe word or emoji would be to indicate to that family or friend or you that they actually need the police, or that they can't speak today because it's not safe. Anything that you agree between you. It's about them getting online support. Our local services SafeNet have developed a web chat service so people don't have to be on the phone, they can do it online. There's a wealth of national online support web chats as well that people can access if they're unable to speak or they don't feel comfortable speaking. It's about them updating services of their situation. So, for example, in lockdown, some perpetrators that don't usually live in the home may have moved in the home to self-isolate altogether. It's about them just letting their services involved with them know that actually the perpetrator's moved in with it. This is what my current situation looks like. Also, children can be used in safety planning if appropriate for the age that they're at. So it's about speaking with their children and having, again, in place with them a safe word or emoji or an action so that the children knows if mum says this, then they need to go to a certain room in the house, or they need to go and get the neighbour, or they need to ring the police, etc. And safety planning is also about them understanding their opportunities to leave and opportunities to access support, particularly during COVID, because the usual places that they might have been able to go might be closed to them. So it could be about them having refuge phone numbers on them, making sure that they have a little stash of money to take, or clothes, ID, any medication that they may need. So it is what it says it is. It's about trying to stay safer in the relationship where possible, and trying to leave as safely as possible. But as with anything with domestic abuse, there's associated risks to all safety planning, and they need to understand that. So what to do if you're concerned about domestic abuse, or if somebody actually makes a disclosure to you. So again, consider safety and risk at all times. Try and find a safe way that you can talk to somebody. Most of the time during COVID, it's going to be over the phone. So check in with them that they're all right to speak, that it's safe for them to speak. And if not, how else can you get in touch with them? Can you email? Can you text? When somebody does disclose, or if you have suspicions, making sure that we're not judgmental, that we listen to the person, that we believe what they're saying and take it as credible. Thinking about the risks, as we've already discussed, risk to yourself, them, the children. Offering them support, making sure that they know that support is available, being led by them as to what they want. Sometimes we want to rescue people in domestic abuse situations. We want to pick them up and take them out of it. Sometimes that's not what they want. So it's about listening to that person. What do they want? What support do they feel that they can accept at this time? It may be checking out what services are already involved with them. If you know that they have, speaking to those services, sharing your information with those services, checking whether there's already things in place for them. As I said previously, if you've got safeguarding concerns for vulnerable adults or children, contacting the EHASH team or the police. And ensure that you're recording your actions or what you're doing. Make sure that we're doing something. So always act. If somebody's disclosed to us or we've got concerns, always do something about it. If you're not sure what to do about it, you can speak to your line manager or you can get advice from one of our specialist domestic abuse agencies. But that is the most important thing, that we make sure that we do something, that we record what we're doing, because obviously if we do have homicides and we look at every agency that have been involved with that family, and people have to submit what their agency involvement has been, what their actions were, etc. So it's very important that we have a clear log of what we've done for this family, what the rationale behind it was, and what actions we've taken. So if anything from this slide, I would just stress to consider risk and always take action if you're concerned or if somebody has disclosed domestic abuse to you. So just in terms of domestic abuse as a priority for Rochdale Council, for the local authority, it's a huge priority for us as a local authority. One of the things that they have done in Rochdale Council is appoint my post. My post is a relatively new post for Rochdale. I only started in this job last year, but I have a history of 20 years plus in domestic abuse. And the reason that they appointed my post is that they wanted to have that oversight on what is going on in terms of domestic abuse locally. We wanted to have a better understanding of what partner agencies are doing and pull that work together so that people aren't duplicating, so that we're making the best use of our resources and that we can identify what our gaps are in our resources locally. Also for community safety, which is the department that I work in, Rochdale Community Safety Partnership has 5 priorities that they are tackling as a borough, and domestic abuse is now one of those priorities. So that makes it a strategic priority for Rochdale as a borough, which it wasn't prior to 2 years ago, I think. We also have a domestic abuse steering group now that was developed at the same time that my post was developed. And what that steering group is a strategic meeting within the council that is attended by our statutory partners. So it's chaired by the police, it's attended by health, children's social care, adult care, etc. And the point of that meeting is to lead on the domestic abuse strategy locally, but also to ensure that, as I said, we know what we are doing as a borough for domestic abuse, instead of different agencies and partners going off doing different things and we're spending money twice on things. We're pulling all that work together in that steering group. Linked into that steering group, we have a domestic abuse provider forum, which is chaired by myself, and I am the link between the two. And that provider forum has our specialist domestic abuse agencies that attend it, and that's Victim Support, SafeNet, Rochdale Connections Trust, etc. If you think your agency needs to be part of that provider forum, please contact me directly and we can sort that out. And what we do at the provider forum is those providers share good practice. I am the link from the local authority as to what's going on in terms of local authority. We identify funding pots that we can apply for, and we update each other on what each different organisation is doing currently. So again, we're not trying to duplicate as a borough. We know who's doing what and how it fits in with the wider need of our communities. Investment. Rochdale Council has just invested 185 grand into having 4 more IDVAs, and they are our high risk independent domestic abuse advocates that work for for victim support. 4 more, that means it's doubled. That contract now has 8 IDVAs in it, only on a temporary basis. Until we can evidence what those IDVAs achieve. Because of the wealth of the problem in Rochdale, because of the scale of the problem of domestic abuse, we were getting too many referrals into our IDVA service, too many high-risk cases for them to deal with. So Rochdale Council has now invested that further amount of money. We're also doing a needs assessment locally, which is being done by myself and public health. And that needs assessment is to look at data and statistics in the borough so that we have an understanding of what the problem is, and then from that identify where our gaps are in terms of provision, and then a report will go to Cabinet in December making recommendations locally about what we feel we need for domestic abuse. So it's something that the local authority takes very seriously. I attend meetings in Greater Manchester so that we're aware of what work is going on in other boroughs, and also that we can share good practice and tap into any funding that may be available within those boroughs. So, local domestic abuse services during the coronavirus. So, as I said, local domestic abuse services are available during COVID. The police will come out. As I said, press 55 if people are unable to speak when they ring 999. Our commission services locally, and that means which services are funded by the council for specialist domestic abuse services, are Rochdale Victim Support. They have an IDVA service which works with high-risk victims of domestic abuse, and they are identified as high risk by the DASH risk assessment that I talked about earlier. And that service is for male and female victims of domestic abuse, and they offer support with safety planning, supporting people through the legal process. They can help them get into refuge and apply for legal and civil remedies such as injunctions, non-molestation orders, etc. Their details are on there. Then we've got SafeNet. SafeNet deliver our refuge provision in Rochdale, and they also have a floating support service that works with medium risk men and male and female victims. SafeNet, we have just allocated 18 additional bed spaces for SafeNet. So they've got the refuge, which is 12 bed spaces, and we've just given them 18 additional bed spaces during COVID-19 in preparation for what we think there may be a spike in our referrals to refuge. So they're managing huge amounts of accommodation at the moment, and they still have their floating support service that works with people in the community. Again, male and female. In terms of male accommodation, SafeNet have safe houses out of borough for male victims of domestic abuse. So if you've got males fleeing, you can contact them for support as well. Other services that we have available, Rochdale Women's Welfare, you may have heard of them. They are support for black and minority ethnic women that may be affected by forced marriage, female genital mutilation or sexual assaults. They're currently open Monday to Friday 10 till 2, the number's on there. Rochdale Connections Trust, they are support for female victims, children and male perpetrators of domestic abuse. Again, their numbers on there. These agencies are still running during COVID-19. They may be doing it from home, they may have limited opening hours, but they're still open and they're still available for support. NESTAC, that is a therapeutic support for adult women, children and young people that may be affected by female genital mutilation, and they work across Greater Manchester, including Rochdale. We also deliver the Freedom Programme locally across Rochdale. Usually it's delivered in children's centres. RCT also deliver it. Rochdale Women's Welfare deliver it in Urdu and Punjabi. At the moment, they're offering Zoom sessions to deliver the Freedom Programme. So if you've got women that want to attend that, it's still ongoing. And that's a 12-week programme for women to understand domestic abuse and the effects of it. Break for Change, I mentioned it before, that is a 10-week programme for families where young people are being abusive to their parents or carers. Again, obviously, we're not doing group settings of that, but you can still access support for that. You can access a one-to-one worker for your family via Zoom sessions. So for any families you know that are experiencing child-to-parent violence, we do have a specialist offer in Rochdale, and not every borough across Greater Manchester does, so that's something that is quite unique for us to have locally. And then across Greater Manchester, but also working in Rochdale, we have the LGBT Foundation. They provide support to anyone who's 16 or over who identifies under the umbrella term of LGBT, which is lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender. And then Independent Choices, again, they work across Manchester with that community. And I think it's LGBT Foundation that has access to specialist accommodation for the LGBT community as well. So they're just a snapshot of some of the services that you've got available. If you go on our web pages, Rochdale www.gov.uk/domestic abuse. There's a wealth of information in there. There's information for you as professionals about the training that's available or guidance available. There's information about online support for people that can't ring or want to do it via web chats and stuff. There's national helpline numbers. There's all the local services that I just mentioned, and there is templates of safety planning if you do decide to do that work with your families or clients. So that would be, for me, that would be the place that I would go if I was a practitioner in Rochdale and I wanted to find out what services there were. Those web pages, I constantly make sure that they are up to date. So any information that you have on there should be up to date. And if we're sending you to other web pages via there, we will only put on their web pages that are up to date and that are monitored. So we shouldn't be sending you off on a wild goose chase to a service that doesn't exist anymore. So it's something that we are on top of, domestic abuse web pages, particularly during COVID-19. So I think that is it from my end. I apologise if I've rambled on, and also for some of the phone calls that have been popping up on my screen throughout the process. If anybody's got any questions, then I'd be happy to answer them.
We've got a couple of questions that's popped up in the chat. So